So I'm Rabbi Charley Baginsky. As Deborah said, I'm the Chief Executive of Liberal Judaism. But more importantly for today, I am third generation. And today, my dad and I are going to be in conversation. And as we were planning for this, we were having a little think about why is it that we're here having this conversation. And I think actually some of it is about the fact that it's given us a chance to explore what does it mean for us to be second and third generations, but perhaps more interestingly or more provocatively, what do we think of each other's place in the question of being a future generation. And so we're going to explore a little bit of that, and what we hope is at the end or somewhere through the conversation that you'll join us and that we'll hear your questions and some of your comments as well. Dad, do you want to begin a little bit about why you think and also about our background and our families?
Yes, well, I echo that and apologies as well for the confusion about the names. We thought we'd start with something about the Goldenberg and Baginski families, my mother and my father's families, just so that everybody's aware of what we're talking about as the session goes on. My mother came from Vienna. She was the middle of 5 children. Her parents and her older brother and sister had come from Galicia at the beginning of the First World War, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and made their way to Vienna via Budapest. She left Vienna in 1938, begged by her mother to leave. She very much wanted to go to Palestine. She was an ardent Zionist, but she had the opportunity, thanks to her older brother, to come to England. And that's what she did, was the only member of her family to come to England. The others survived, but all went to Palestine and later on. My father's family was very different from my mother's in that they were very unorthodox, should I say, religiously. My mother's family was a extremely orthodox, traditionally Jewish family. And my father grew up in Upper Silesia, which I'm sure some of you will know that it was had a different status from the rest of Germany. He was one of 4 children. He came to England in 1939. His sister came to England in 1939, quite late on in April 1939. And their 2 brothers did not survive. So I think that's probably enough for now about who they are. If I refer to my mother as Erna and my father as Kurt, then I think that's probably the easiest way we can talk about them.
Thank you, Dad. I'm really interested because I think about this question a lot for myself and with my own kids. Is when were you first aware that this story was part of your identity growing up?
You know, it's really difficult to untangle your memories from what you consciously thought at the time. But I do have 2 very vivid memories of early on in my life. First of all, of course, when you grow up as a young child, you take for granted that that is the way that things are. It didn't seem anything unusual. But there are 2 things that really stick out in my mind very clearly. For one of them was when I was 5, just 5, turned 5, and I was about to start primary school. And my mother said to me, when you go to school, there are certain words you mustn't say. I think one of them was Jesus. I think one of them was Christ. And I was very confused about what the rest were. I wondered about Almighty. Was that okay to say? and when I went to school, why were they singing about Jerusalem? Um, so that was a source of confusion. The other very vivid memory I have is also very young, and I don't know how old I was then, but I think maybe 6, 7, at most 8, but probably not. And I think that there must have been an item on the radio about the number of people number of Jews who'd been murdered during the Holocaust. And I remember my mother telling me that there are about 5 million, 6 million Jews who had lost their lives. And I think that was the first time that I became aware, really, that something really cataclysmic had happened. I wonder about you, what your first memories are.
Well, I've been trying to give that some thought, and as you say, it's really difficult to untangle what has always been part of your identity to a specific point. I think some of my earliest memories of us having Friday night dinner, and that the topics of conversation that we had what seemed very different to the topics of conversation that other families that I was at school, I didn't go to a Jewish school, would have at dinner time, and that there were certain political issues or educational issues that seemed to always have a Jewish slant to them. And I think that was, in some ways, the first entry into the fact that we had a different entry into this country's history than perhaps my peers. That even from a very early age, it felt like that I was kind of carrying our origin story with us. That although we were British, there was a kind of there was a plus to it, and also that was part of our Jewish story. So from Seder night as well, that there would be conversations kind of interwoven into the Haggadah, into the Seder story that were about our own personal histories. And I think they were amorphous in some ways at the beginning and became more and more profound and articulated. I have a memory as well with Grandma, with Erna, of doing a sort of family history quite early on and recording her on an old-fashioned tape recorder and getting some insights, sort of the watered-down version or the sanitized version, really, and that opening up an area of having further conversations. But mainly anytime anything came on, we were a family that had Radio 4 on permanently, whether that was in the house or in the car, and every time something came up that was to do with refugees or to do with World War II, or that there was a very personal slant to it that kind of came interwoven into our history.
Okay, and I mean, I think also where our experiences differ from second and third generation is one of the things that I was very conscious of growing up was a kind of absence, really. I'm not sure that I would have articulated it or could have articulated, except I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a big family? It turned out that there was a big family on Erna's side that we didn't know about, and what had become of some of them. And on my father's side, there were big blanks, just really big blanks there. And those blanks, I mean, maybe we come onto that a bit later on, but there were big blanks that I couldn't fill and that couldn't be filled.
I think I didn't have a sense of that growing up, I suppose. I think I had a very clear sense of why family was important, or a sense that family was very important. But I think the holes or the absence or the need to search for more and explore where that identity came from, I think I became aware of much later. Growing up, I think it was values, the value of family, and that it was something that held a different importance to you in a different way. But where that came from, I don't think I understood until later.
I think that's a very difficult thing to understand. And I have to say, I came to all of that very much later as well, in a conscious way, um, rather than not. Um, Perhaps we should move on and pick up some of those threads a little bit later on.
I think though there's a similar question about Judaism there, about I know for myself that Judaism had a different role because of feeling some sort of responsibility to be openly Jewish at school. You said earlier about certain things you shouldn't say in terms of Jesus and Christ. I had I think a slightly different experience, which was of feeling not of hiding anything about my Jewish identity, not that you necessarily hid it, but of being very explicit and loud about it in non-Jewish contexts. But I imagine you had a slightly different experience with that growing up.
Well, I think that's a really interesting thing, actually, because later on in my life, when I started to go to work, and I worked with, and I was a teacher at the beginning of my working life, that I had a number of Jewish colleagues who never told anybody that they were Jewish, certainly didn't tell children in school that they were Jewish. I always was upfront about that, and I always spoke about that and didn't hide it, possibly to preclude the chance of it coming up, to kind of warn people off. Perhaps that was the reason for it. I think also that, by the time you came along, that we were obviously as a family more established in this country. And I was always aware, I suppose, that my parents, well, they were very, very grateful, which is not a word you would hear now, I don't think, but very, very grateful for having had sanctuary in this country, having been able to come to this country. And I think their attitude, like quite a lot of other people probably, was that you keep your head down, that you don't make a big song and dance about things, and that you just get on with things without making a fuss. And I think that by the time, you're, I think anyway, a more confident generation, a louder generation, and people are, I don't know, more conscious, I think, about identity and about being proud and loud and proud about their identity than was the case when I was a child, a young child.
I think though it's interesting. Grandma always I was at the beginning of my journey to the rabbinate when Grandma was still alive. She used to call me the Lady Rabbi, and I've been kind of mind blown about the difference you spoke at the beginning about how where her family came from to where the family ended up, and I felt that difference very proudly of and also a sense of responsibility with it. I did a year course Shnat in Israel when I was 18 as part of youth movement experience, and I think that being part of a youth movement and then going to Israel and spending a year there and with our family who was there and seeing that ability to be 24 hours Jewish in a way that was really profound and definitely affected my coming back from Israel and ending up in the rabbinate and wanting to bring that sense of identity to other people who hadn't necessarily found a way of expressing that here. And I feel like that was very much formed by my experience with Grandma and the conversations around identity and what it meant to be Jewish in the UK, and as well as finding a Judaism that was very reflected in social justice issues because of that, being very grateful of coming here as a refugee to this country and what this country had given her and her family, in the sense that we were growing and able to be established here. But I'm also interested in, as you've got older and seen us as children and then growing up into adults, whether that identity for you as a second generation has changed and has shaped your thinking.
Well, the simple answer is yes. I think that okay, this is rather personal, but quite important and relevant, is that when I was in my late 40s, I had went through a personal crisis where I sought some help, really, to address some issues that I had. And I was asked I went to speak to somebody who ran group therapy. And he asked me about my background, asked me about my childhood. And I said, I had a very happy childhood. My parents were wonderful. Everything was, fine. I don't know why you're asking me this. And it seems rather late on in somebody's life, really, to come to this. But I don't think I started until I went through that situation in my life, that I started to think that my background had actually had some impact, not just on positive things, but had some impact on my, the way I thought about myself, about the way I thought generally about things. And really, it was after that I started to look much more closely, I think, at, trying to fill in the gaps about my family.
And what, first of all, thank you for sharing that, because I know that is personal, and I think in some ways us as children had a better sense of that it must have affected you, and to be able to get to the point that we can have a conversation about it, I think has been a huge difference, both in our understanding about why this was so important and how it filled gaps in our own. But this question of responsibility and memory, you've taken, you and Sydney, your brother, taken that concept of responsibility and memory really very seriously, and have explored, stories of people who didn't have voice, and given that. I wonder, not only why is that important, I think most of us on the call understand it's important, but what do you think, what are you giving us? What's us as the next generation? What do you hold me, and I have 2 brothers and 3 children, and what's our responsibility in that? Where do you see us fitting?
Okay, I mean, there's a lot there. First of all, just to say that my explorations of the family and trying to fill the gap is where it started for me, was not really about the responsibility, but was trying to understand the absence of why didn't we have relatives? Why didn't we have relatives that were close by? Why is it, I only had one grandparent alive when I was born. He lived in Israel, and I never spoke to him. He never spoke to me. I never heard his voice. He died when I was quite young, but there was never any communication there. There was also all the conversations that, I mean, that's another difference, I think, between our generations, that when I was a child, I spent a lot of time sitting in a room with adults talking in German, probably thinking that I didn't understand. And I astound myself even now, thinking, how do I know so much pre-war domestic German, but I do. I obviously understood quite a lot. And I would hear my parents talking with my aunt Edith and her husband and a couple of other people who came from the same town, Rosenberg, and the names that they would talk about. And I think one of the things, just going back to what we were talking about earlier, is that in those circumstances, everybody was perfect. So all of those people who had died before their time, the people who were murdered, the people who were gone, the absences, nobody obviously ever said a word about they had no faults. My expectations of myself and of you and your brothers was that everything should be perfect,
Yep.
you know, and that somehow we were falling short. I was falling short. So I just think that's kind of.
I think that's such a, it's the first time, I mean, you know, in front of 155 people, that I think actually we've kind of acknowledged that that's where some of the responsibility, I think then it's a pressure as well of holding that need to be perfect, and to have a really deep sense of responsibility has been very present in our lives. But I think, you know, something that just struck me in what you were saying was how important actually getting to a point where you can have some of these conversations becomes, and that does change in time. I think having children for me has, and seeing you teach my children about the family history. You and Joshua have a son who's now 12, but when he was in year 2, they did Second World War as part of the curriculum. So at school, actually all 3 of them have now gone through that. And each of them, very interestingly, has gone to their own personal history and done, you know, a presentation for the rest of their class about their family history, and feels that even though it's now several generations on, they never met, or Josh met grandma, but he was, you know, too young really, other than from photos to remember, has taken on in some ways that story as well. Is that something that you think you could have imagined happening? That
Yes, I mean, I think it's what my expectations are hopes rather than expectations for your generation and the generation that follows. And the hope is I can't expect anything of you as far as the remembrance is concerned and telling the stories, but I do have hopes that you will. And I feel I was just, before we started, I was just having a look through some of the records and papers and things that I've collected over the last 20 years, particularly. And I was just thinking, there's more here than I can begin to deal with. And I do hope that if, whatever's left, when I can no longer carry on with that will be picked up by you and by your brothers. And in a way, you've already done that. You're already doing that. And even, we're quite a dispersed family even now. One of your brothers has lived in America for the last 10 years, another one in Israel for the last 5 years. Both of them, even your brother who has very little to do with Judaism, has actually, he's visited Berlin with me, where...
To be fair, though, he is walking around with the name Abraham Henry Baginski.
True.
There is not an awful lot, even in New York, that you can do to escape your history with a name like that, really. And I think those names are significant, that you did give us something in that, particularly with Abe that sense of history. Just to come back a little bit to your parents, is there something that you wish that they had done differently in telling, in the education about what happened, or the preservation of the memory, and maybe something you wish you'd done differently for us?
I mean, all of those really. So as far as my parents are concerned, unlike a lot of, they did talk about what happened, although a lot with my mother, very little with my father. So what I learned from my father was more about what I overheard, what he talked about in front of me rather than to me. I can't uh, feel, well, they should have done something differently, because I understand completely where they were coming from. And I think, when we were talking a bit earlier about, second generation, the term second generation, the term third generation, I think my father, who died a long time ago now, back in 1975, I think he would have struggled with the term second generation, third generation, because I think for a lot of people of that first generation, that what they were trying to do was to give their children a better life, a freer life, not to saddle you with the sadness and the tragedy in their lives and the sense of loss. And I think what they perhaps didn't realize was that it does rub off, even if you don't talk about it. And as I've got older, sometimes I can remember my father sighing very deeply. He would be driving and sigh apropos of nothing that we were talking about. And I understand that now. And I think I probably know the kinds of things that he was sighing about. So I can't feel that they should have done something differently. I feel about myself, and perhaps I shouldn't blame myself for that, but I feel myself that I should have asked more questions of my father, that I should have been more direct with him.
I think one thing I would really like, one thing that becomes more and more important to me, is the making sure that we know where stuff is. And I think, I have this conversation a lot with both my brothers, but also with my cousins, that we need to be more intentional about our finding out. That we don't want to go through the same exploration that you're going through now. We need to know where stuff is, and for it to be, we live in this amazing technological age now, that of being able to write things down and knowing where it's stored. And I spend a lot of time particularly when I was a community rabbi, encouraging people to write things down, so that people who come after them know where it is. And I think that's the same with our history now, is that it's good to know what something is, and to remember, and to put names to those faces, and to understand that, but to be intentional. I think we've done a lot of this passing on of memory through anecdotal storytelling, and of after you've been somewhere or taken a visit to a cemetery, or to tell those stories, but we haven't done the intentional writing down and documenting and knowing where it is. And that would be my big shout out for anybody out there, is write it down, tell people where this information is, and what it means.
It will
give
be
it context. Done. Thank you. It will be. That's you hear it here. You're our witnesses for that. Just changing direction slightly, and onto, we've lived through, particularly very recently, a kind of flashes of or the uncovering in a more volatile way, anti-Semitism. And I do wonder whether your history influences your understanding of contemporary anti-Semitism, and perhaps also the conversations that we have about anti-Semitism.
Yes, it does very strongly. I mean, I think that you're growing up in the family that I grew up in. I think your antennae for, or my, I don't know, it's so hard to generalize really, actually, but my antennae anyway, my sensitivity to anti-Semitism, I think, has always been quite high. What happened the last few, without sort of getting into party political stuff, but what happened in the Labour Party, for example, and the kind of some of the stuff that I've seen on social media as well over the last few years has been really shocking. And it, I kind of think back to some of the arguments I had when I was a teenager with my parents saying, you know, well, things are different now, things are, and how shocked and my father would have been about what was going on, what was happening here. And I mean, this is another very personal anecdote, but when I was, again, I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. We had a car for the first time parked outside the house. It must have been autumn. There was condensation on the car, and somebody had drawn a swastika on the car. And my father asked me whether I'd done it. And it's always, I've always thought, how could he ask me such a question? I didn't even know what a swastika was, but how could he possibly think that I would have done such a thing? And I was talking to your mother about this a couple of days ago. And I mean, I think about it a little bit differently now, that I think he would have been, I think he was so, as much as he had been a patriotic German, he became a very patriotic Englishman. We had a big Union Jack and a blue pole in the garage that he'd bought for the coronation that hung out the window. And I think he couldn't believe, really, that that could happen here. And I think that's probably why he asked me. Yes, I think that...
It's interesting hearing you say that, because I think a lot of, you know, when we've had, we still have on Friday night dinners, lively debates about things, but perhaps one of the most contentious or one of the issues that we find the most difficult things to talk about are about political situation in Israel, about anti-Semitism. And I think that that's because we do come loaded with our own, with those formative conversations that we have about those issues, and that, like probably everybody on this call, these topics feel personal in a way that other topics don't. But they have been some of the most difficult. I have one last question for you, but before I ask it, I'm going to ask Deborah whether there's, I think you maybe have a comment or a question, and then we've got a question that maybe we'll end on.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. Thank you. So yeah, I'll read a couple of comments first. So someone wrote, such a beautiful conversation between father and daughter. Thank you so much. And someone has written, I'm always surprised to hear a second generation person of similar age to me not having felt internalized shame or anxiety about being exposed as a youngster. Both my parents survived concentration and prison camps. Internal shame and fear about being exposed as Jewish featured very much in my inner psyche and affected my overt behavior. So that's a comment and a question for you, Charlie. But before I read it, and we've only got a few minutes, I just want to thank you. Obviously, I'm going to thank you at the end, but William, particularly, obviously, this is, I feel like you've really opened yourself up here, and both of you and to each other. And I was just wondering, has it been easier because you're not in the same room? You're on screen, and there's an audience, so it's kind of almost like a safe space, if you like. I mean, it's kind of not a safe space, but it is a safe space to have these conversations. And there are many of these conversations that I haven't had with my own children yet. But there's never a good time. So I hope we've given you this good time now to have these conversations. Anyway, Charlie, let me read you this question, which is, I'm involved in a Holocaust education program for the post-bar bat mitzvah group at Finchley Progressive Synagogue. How important do you think it is for synagogues to get involved in ensuring that its young members know more about the Holocaust, and more importantly, see they have an important role in ensuring the stories continue to be told, even if they do not come from a background which includes the Holocaust?
Thank you. I mean, really excellent question, and one actually that I think I do spend quite a lot of time thinking about, particularly because in our congregations we have a really diverse spectrum of people who come from lots of different places, and maybe that do feel slightly slightly out of their comfort area when they're having conversations about the Holocaust, if they don't feel like it's part of their personal history and feel inadequate in being part of that conversation. And I think that there was something really powerful that happened when I was at Kingston Liberal Synagogue for many years, and we did the Holocaust education joint with the United Synagogue for local school children. And it was the first opportunity for many of them to hear a survivor and subsequently to hear second generation speak. And one of the things I continually heard from those school children was how mind-blowing it was to be that generation responsible for being the last generation to meet survivors. And I think for our own children within our communities, in the same way as when we talk about Pesach and we talk about Seder and we say it's as though you were there and know very clearly that we weren't there, right? You know, but we have that language embedded into our Jewish tradition. And I think that's what we've got to take, those two things of the responsibility that comes with being the last generation, and we are the last generation, and at the same time, the sense that we've got embedded into our tradition how to talk about a story as though it belongs to us, even when we weren't literally standing there. And so I think that we absolutely have a responsibility to interweave it into our education, also because it does inform our present. And that was kind of my last question. I wanted to answer yours a little bit, Deborah, about what you said about, is this a safe space? I think I'm really privileged in my job of being able to hold conversations. But for my dad, this was a new experience. And actually, what I said before about recording information intentionally, having intentional conversations of making the space for it is a real privilege. So I want to thank you, because we did have, we met up, we have been in the same room quite a few times, and we have had some of these conversations in preparing them, but knowing that we were doing it in a specific moment did give us an opportunity. And maybe that's where we'll end, which is, I do want to think that if you just, very quickly, I guess, to say, I think that having this history, even though it was mine, but also taking the responsibility for it, has been enriching. Definitely, I think I would not be doing the job that I'm doing today or feel so passionately about the work that I do if it wasn't for being part of this story. And I wonder whether for you, it's also been enriching, as well as very difficult and having trauma involved in it, whether it's also been enriching.
Yes, I mean, can I just say also, Deborah, thank you very much. Yes, it has been a very unusual experience for Charlotte and I to be able, excuse me, to talk when they're three young children, dogs, cats, and the rest. It's very hard to have these conversations, and yes, that's been very, welcome.
Right, we've literally got 1 minute left.
Okay, so well, yes, it has been enriching in lots of ways, very heartening. I wanted to say something about the role of your mother and your, who was a convert to Judaism, and I think the role that she has played
Absolutely.
in all of that. And I'm really proud that you want to continue that story. Means an awful lot.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Well, there are more questions and lots of people thanking you very much for having this very personal conversation with us and sharing it. So thank you.